Emotional leverage explained. A woman sits across from her partner at the kitchen table. She has been thinking about this conversation for 3 days. She has rehearsed it in her head. She has timed it for a calm evening. She has waited until the dishes were done and the kids were in bed. She says, "I need to talk to you about something." He looks up, his face changes. Not a lot, just enough. His jaw tightens. His eyes narrow slightly. He exhales through his nose. She notices all of it, and in that half second, before a single word of the actual conversation has started, something shifts. She feels it in her chest. A small pull, a quiet alarm. She is already starting to edit what she was going to say. She had planned to say, "I feel like I'm doing most of the planning and organizing in this house, and I need that to change." But now, watching his face, she adjusts. She softens it. She adds a cushion. She says, "I don't want this to sound like I'm blaming you. I just feel like maybe we could split things up a little differently." The meaning changed. The ask changed. The weight changed. And none of it happened because he said a word. It happened because she saw what one sentence did to him. She saw the reaction before the conversation even started. And she pulled back. That is emotional leverage. Not a threat. Not a manipulation. Not even something most people would notice. Just a quiet force that bends one person's words around another person's feelings. And it happens everywhere. It happens when a coworker drafts an email, deletes it, rewrites it, and then reads it one more time before sending it. Not because the content is wrong, but because the person receiving it might react. It happens when a friend decides not to mention that a comment hurt them, because the last time they brought something up, it turned into a 2-hour conversation about the other person's intentions. It happens when an adult child rehearses a phone call in the car before dialing, choosing the words that are least likely to cause a reaction. None of these are dramatic situations. None of them involve raised voices or slammed doors. But all of them involve one person adjusting their behavior around another person's emotional response. And that adjustment, repeated enough times, becomes the shape of the relationship itself. What emotional leverage actually is. Emotional leverage is what happens when one person's emotional reaction has more power in a conversation than the other person's need to speak. That is the whole thing. It is not complicated, but it is one of the most common forces shaping how people talk to each other. What they say, what they hold back, and what they eventually stop trying to say at all. Here's the plain version. In any relationship, whether it is a marriage, a friendship, a family, or a workplace, people have things they need to say. Concerns, frustrations, boundaries, observations, requests. And in a balanced dynamic, both people can bring those things to the table and talk about them. But when one person's emotional response to hearing something becomes the thing the other person has to manage, the conversation is no longer about the issue. It is about the reaction. And whoever controls the reaction controls the conversation. This does not require yelling. It does not require anger. It does not require dramatic behavior. Sometimes it is just a sigh, a silence, a look, a shift in body language, a withdrawal, a tone of voice that says, "You have upset me, and now that is your problem to fix." That is leverage, the ability to make someone else responsible for your comfort during a conversation that was supposed to be about their concern. And the person on the other side of it learns very quickly. They learn that raising an issue costs something, not in practical terms, not in consequences, but in emotional weight, in tension, in the feeling that they now have to repair something just because they said what they were thinking. So they start choosing differently. They start editing. They start waiting. They start deciding that some things are not worth bringing up. Not because the things do not matter, but because the cost of saying them is too high. Think of it this way. Imagine you had to pay a fee every time you told the truth. Not a financial fee, an emotional one. Every time you said what you actually thought, the other person would become hurt, or cold, or distant, or upset. And you would have to spend the next hour, or the next day, or the next week repairing that reaction. How many times would you pay that fee before you stopped? How many conversations would you have before you started deciding which truths were worth the cost and which ones were not? Most people stop paying pretty quickly, not because they are cowards, because they are doing math. And the math does not work. That is how emotional leverage works. Not through force, through cost. How emotional leverage forms. Emotional leverage does not appear all at once. It builds slowly, and it usually starts with something that looks like a normal emotional reaction. The first time. A man tells his friend that he felt left out when the friend made weekend plans without him. The friend does not get angry. He gets hurt. He says, "I can't believe you'd think I'd do that on purpose." That really stings. Now, the man who raised the issue is in an odd position. He came in with a concern, but now his friend is the one who seems hurt. And the man feels something new, guilt. Not because he did anything wrong, but because his words caused a visible emotional response. And he does not want to be the person who causes pain. So he backtracks. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry. Forget I said anything." The concern disappears. The friend's feelings get tended to. And a small lesson is stored. The second time. A few weeks later, the man has another concern. This time, the friend borrowed something and returned it damaged. The man thinks about bringing it up, but then he remembers what happened last time. He remembers the look on his friend's face, the guilt he felt, the way the conversation flipped. He decides to let it go, not because it does not matter, because the emotional math does not work out. The cost of raising it is greater than the cost of absorbing it. The third time. There is no third time. The man has already learned. He stops bringing things up. He stops raising concerns. He manages the friendship by managing himself, keeping his observations quiet, adjusting his expectations downward, and taking on the work of keeping things smooth. And the friend never asked him to do any of that. The friend may not even know it is happening. But the dynamic is already set. That is how emotional leverage forms. One person's reaction becomes too expensive for the other person to trigger. And so the other person stops trying. This happens in marriages. A wife wants to talk about how money is being spent. But every time she raises it, her husband gets quiet for 2 days. He does not yell. He does not argue. He just goes cold. And after a few rounds of that, she stops bringing up money. Not because the concern went away, because the silence afterward is worse than the problem. This happens at work. An employee wants to push back on an unreasonable deadline. But every time she brings up a concern, her manager looks wounded and says, "I thought we were a team." Now the employee carries the guilt of being seen as not a team player, so she stops pushing back. She just absorbs the workload. This happens in families. A grown daughter wants to set a boundary with her mother about unannounced visits. But every time she tries, her mother cries and says, "I just wanted to see my grandchildren. I didn't know I needed permission." Now the daughter is the villain. So she stops setting boundaries. She just endures the visits. In every case, the person with leverage is not doing anything dramatic. They are simply having a reaction. But that reaction carries weight, and the other person is the one who has to carry it. What makes this so effective is that the reaction is real. The person is not faking it. They genuinely feel hurt or wounded or disappointed. And because the reaction is real, it is almost impossible to challenge. You cannot tell someone, "Stop feeling that way." You cannot say, "Your reaction is too expensive for me." The feelings are legitimate, but the effect of those feelings is that someone else stops speaking. And this is the core tension of emotional leverage. The reaction itself might be genuine, but the pattern it creates is still controlling. Both things can be true at the same time. A person can honestly feel hurt and still be the reason someone else goes silent. The person on the receiving end senses this contradiction, but usually cannot name it. They think, "Well, they were really upset. I can't blame them for feeling that way." And they are right. They cannot. But that does not change the fact that they have stopped bringing things up. That does not change the fact that the relationship has narrowed. That does not change the fact that one person's feelings have become the ceiling of the conversation and the other person has learned to live below it. How emotional leverage changes communication. Once emotional leverage exists in a relationship, communication changes. Not obviously. Not in ways that outsiders would notice, but in ways that the person on the lower end of the dynamic feels constantly. Words get softer. The person who has learned that raising issues is expensive starts padding their language. They add qualifiers. They apologize before they have said anything. They frame their needs as questions instead of statements. Instead of, "I need you to stop canceling plans last minute." They say, "I totally understand you're busy, and I don't want to make a big deal of this, but is there any way you could maybe try to give me a little more notice if you need to cancel?" The meaning is the same, but the delivery is completely different. And the reason is not politeness, it is protection. They are trying to get the message across without triggering the reaction they know is coming. Timing becomes strategic. The person with less leverage starts thinking carefully about when to bring things up. Not just what to say, when to say it. They wait for good moods. They avoid stressful days. They test the water with small comments before making bigger ones. They look for windows. This is not healthy communication. This is surveillance. They are monitoring the other person's emotional state to calculate whether it is safe to speak. Silence grows. Over time, the person stops bringing things up altogether, not all at once, gradually. They let one thing go, then another, then another. Each time they tell themselves it is not worth it. And each time, the pile of unsaid things gets bigger. But silence is not peace. Silence is pressure. And it builds. The person carrying the silence starts to feel distant. They pull back. They become less open. They share less. They laugh less. They go through the motions of the relationship, but something behind their eyes has gone quiet. And the other person, the one with leverage, often notices the distance but misreads it. They say, "What's wrong?" And the answer they get is nothing, because the real answer is too expensive to give. This nothing is one of the most common words in a relationship shaped by emotional leverage. It does not mean nothing. It means everything. It means, I have something to say, and I have already decided you cannot hear it. It means I have done the math, and the cost of honesty is higher than the cost of silence. It means I am choosing peace over truth, and I am hoping you do not ask again. But the person hearing nothing takes it at face value. They accept it, they move on, and the gap between what is real and what is spoken gets a little wider. Apologies flow in one direction. In a relationship shaped by emotional leverage, one person does most of the apologizing. Not because they make more mistakes, because they feel more responsible for the emotional temperature of the conversation. They apologize for bringing things up. They apologize for how they said something. They apologize for the timing. They apologize for the other person's reaction. They even apologize when they were right, because being right does not matter if the other person is upset. And the person with leverage rarely apologizes, not because they are cruel, but because they rarely feel like they have done anything wrong. From their perspective, they just had a feeling. They got hurt. They got quiet. That is not something to apologize for. That is just a reaction. But from the other side, that reaction was a wall. And the person who keeps walking into the wall eventually stops walking forward altogether. Speed changes. When someone has emotional leverage, they tend to respond quickly. They do not have to think about how their words will land. They do not have to manage anyone's feelings. So they speak freely, easily, without calculation. The person on the other side responds slowly. They think before they talk. They reread texts 3 times before sending them. They rehearse conversations in their head. They choose their words carefully, not because they are thoughtful by nature, but because they have learned that the wrong word in the wrong moment will cost them. Watch 2 people texting. One person sends messages quickly in fragments without much thought. The other person types, deletes, retypes, and waits. The first person sends 6 messages in the time it takes the second person to send one. That is not a difference in communication style. That is a difference in what is at stake. One person is talking, the other person is navigating. This creates an imbalance in the pace of conversation. One person is relaxed, the other person is careful. And the careful one is doing all the invisible work of making the conversation feel smooth. Gratitude replaces honesty. Something strange happens when emotional leverage has been in place for a while. The person on the lower end starts being grateful for basic things. They feel relieved when a conversation goes well. They feel thankful when their partner does not react badly to a simple observation. They feel lucky when they can say something honest without consequences. This is a sign that the baseline has shifted. The person is no longer measuring the relationship by whether their needs are met. They are measuring it by whether the other person is upset. And that is a profound change, because once your emotional compass points toward the other person's comfort instead of your own truth, you are no longer navigating for yourself. How people can misread what is happening. Emotional leverage is almost never identified correctly by the people inside it. Both sides misread what is going on, and the misreading keeps the pattern locked in place. The person with leverage thinks the relationship is fine. From their perspective, things are calm. There is no conflict. No one is raising complaints. The other person seems agreeable. Maybe a little quiet sometimes, but nothing alarming. They do not realize that the calm is manufactured. They do not see that the absence of conflict is not the same as the presence of connection. They think things are good because nothing is being said. But nothing is being said because saying things is too expensive. This is one of the most dangerous misreadings in any relationship. The person with leverage interprets silence as satisfaction, and they have no reason to question it because the system is working in their favor. The person without leverage thinks they are the problem. This is where it gets painful. The person who has been editing and adjusting and softening and holding back starts to believe that the problem is them. They think they are too sensitive, too needy, too demanding. They think they should be able to handle things better, let things go more easily, not care so much. They do not see that their behavior is a response to a dynamic. They see it as a flaw. A woman who has stopped raising concerns with her husband does not think, "I have learned that his reactions are too costly to trigger." She thinks, "I need to stop overreacting to things." She turns the structural problem into a personal failing, and then she works on herself instead of addressing the relationship. This is extremely common. The person carrying the weight of emotional leverage almost always blames themselves first, because the alternative, seeing the dynamic clearly, would require them to name something that feels dangerous to name. Outsiders see personality, not pattern. Friends, family, co-workers, they all see the behavior, but not the cause. They see a woman who is quiet and agreeable, and never makes waves. They call her easygoing. They call her low maintenance. They call her a peacekeeper. What they do not see is that she was not always like this. She became like this because speaking up was too expensive. They see a man who is open and direct and says what he thinks. They call him honest. They call him confident. What they do not see is that he is open and direct because he has never been punished for it. He has never had to choose between honesty and safety. So his openness is not courage. It is comfort. The personality labels stick, and they cover up the dynamic underneath. The cycle looks like compatibility. Here is maybe the strangest part. When emotional leverage is working, the relationship often looks smooth from the outside. One person leads, the other accommodates. There is no fighting, no drama, no visible tension. People call this a good match. They call it balance. They call it complementary. One person is strong, the other is supportive. But what is actually happening is that one person is speaking and the other has stopped. And the stopping looks like agreement because no one can see the pile of things that were never said. At a dinner party, a couple sits side by side. One person tells a story. The other person smiles and nods. To everyone else, this looks like a happy couple. But if you watch closely, you might notice that the quiet partner never adds to the story, never corrects a detail, never offers their version. They have learned that adding their perspective creates friction later. So they sit still. They smile. They let the story be told the way the other person tells it. That is not agreement. That is absence. But it looks exactly the same from the outside. And here is what makes this so hard to untangle. The person who is silent often does not even see it clearly. They have been doing it so long that it feels natural. They think, I'm just not a talker. Or, I don't need to be the center of attention. They have turned a survival strategy into an identity, and the misreading is complete. How the pattern sustains itself. Emotional leverage does not need to be reinforced constantly. Once it is in place, it runs on its own. The person on the lower end does the work of maintaining it without being asked, without being forced, and often without realizing it. The editing becomes automatic. At first, the person with less leverage made a conscious choice to soften their words. They thought about it. They weighed the options. They decided that pulling back was the safer move. But over time, the editing becomes unconscious. They do not even notice they are doing it. They do not realize they are rephrasing things. They do not notice the 3-second pause before they speak, the moment where their brain scans for danger. It just becomes how they talk. And once the editing is automatic, it is very hard to undo, because the person no longer sees it as a choice. They see it as who they are. Small tests get abandoned. Every now and then, the person on the lower end tries. They say something a little more direct. They raise a concern without padding it. They test whether the dynamic has changed. And usually it has not. The reaction comes. The sigh, the silence, the hurt look, the cold shoulder. And the person pulls back again. But here is the thing. Each failed test raises the cost of the next one. After enough tests, the person stops testing. They accept the dynamic is fixed. They stop looking for openings. And the leverage becomes permanent. The person with leverage never has to ask for compliance. This is important. In most cases, the person with emotional leverage is not issuing instructions. They are not saying, don't bring that up. They are not saying, stop complaining. They are not saying, keep your concerns to yourself. They do not have to, because their reactions say it for them. A sigh says, that topic is unwelcome. A silence says, you have made things uncomfortable. A hurt expression says, you are the one causing harm here. A withdrawal says, if you keep this up, I will disappear. None of these are words. None of these are demands. But all of them are instructions. And the other person follows them every time because the emotional consequence of not following them is something they cannot afford. This is what makes emotional leverage different from direct control. Direct control is visible. Someone tells you what to do. You can see it. You can name it. You can push back. But emotional leverage is invisible. No one tells you what to do. You just learn what happens when you do the wrong thing. And you adjust. You adjust until adjusting feels normal. You adjust until you forget that there was ever another way to be. And the person with leverage can honestly say, I never told them to stop talking to me about that. And they would be right. They never did. They never had to. The relationship narrows. Over time, the range of things that can be discussed gets smaller. The things that are off limits are not written down anywhere. But both people know what they are. Certain topics are avoided. Certain feelings are not expressed. Certain conversations are not had. And the relationship gets thinner. Not because there is less love or less care, but because there is less truth. And truth is what keeps a relationship wide. Without it, everything contracts. Two people who have been together for years might find themselves talking mostly about logistics, schedules, errands, what is for dinner, who is picking up the kids. The surface of the relationship stays busy, but underneath, where the real conversations used to live, it has gone quiet. One person might not even notice. They think, we talk all the time. And they do. They talk about tasks. They talk about plans. They talk about the house, the car, the calendar. But they do not talk about how they feel. They do not talk about what they need. They do not talk about what is missing. Because those conversations are in the restricted zone, the territory that was slowly closed off by a dozen small reactions over a dozen years. The person with leverage does not notice the narrowing. They still feel close because they are still getting what they need. But the other person feels it. They feel the walls closing in. They feel the shrinking space between what they think and what they can say. And they carry that gap quietly every day. The workplace version. Emotional leverage is not limited to personal relationships. It shows up at work in ways that are just as powerful and just as invisible. A manager does not yell when an employee pushes back. He looks disappointed. He says, "I'm surprised to hear that from you." He becomes slightly less warm in the days that follow. Not hostile, just cooler. The employee notices, and the next time there is something to push back on, the employee does not. A team leader responds to honest feedback by becoming visibly deflated. She says, "I'm really trying here." The person who gave the feedback now feels guilty. They spend the next week being extra supportive to make up for it, and they never give honest feedback again. A coworker responds to a reasonable boundary by acting wounded. "I thought we were close enough that I could ask you that." Now the person who set the boundary feels like they broke something, so they relax the boundary next time, and the time after that, until the boundary no longer exists. In every case, the mechanism is the same. One person's emotional reaction becomes the thing the other person has to manage, and the conversation stops being about the issue and starts being about the feelings. The workplace version is especially hard to see because it often gets wrapped in language that sounds positive. Teamwork, loyalty, trust, being a good sport, going above and beyond. All of these can be real, but they can also be the vocabulary of emotional leverage. Words that make it feel wrong to say no, wrong to push back, wrong to protect your own time and energy. And the person who cannot say no at work is not weak. They are reading the room correctly. They know what the emotional cost is, and they are choosing to absorb it instead of pay it. That is not a character flaw. That is a calculation, and the calculation often turns out to be right. The employee who pushes back loses the warmth of their manager. The one who does not push back keeps the warmth and loses their weekend. Both are paying a price. One price is visible and one is not. Over time, the workplace version of emotional leverage creates a strange kind of loyalty. The person absorbing the cost feels grateful to the person creating it. They think, "My manager really cares about me." Because the manager is warm when things go well. They only become cold when a boundary is tested. And the employee, desperate to stay in the warm zone, stops testing boundaries entirely. This gets called being dedicated. It gets called being committed. It gets called having a great work ethic. What it actually is, in many cases, is a person performing compliance to avoid the emotional cost of saying no. The family version. Families are where emotional leverage often starts. And families are where it is hardest to see because it is so deeply woven into how people learn to communicate in the first place. A parent who falls apart every time their adult child sets a boundary is using emotional leverage. They may not mean to, they may not know they are doing it, but the effect is the same. The child learns that boundaries cause pain, and they stop setting them. A sibling who gives the silent treatment after a disagreement is using emotional leverage. The silence says, "You hurt me, and now you have to fix it." The other sibling, the one who raised the concern, ends up apologizing. Not because they were wrong, because the silence is unbearable. A family member who says, "After everything I've done for you," in response to a simple request for space, is using emotional leverage. They are linking love to obligation. And the person hearing it feels trapped because rejecting the obligation feels like rejecting the love. These patterns often start in childhood. A child learns early which parent can handle honesty and which one cannot. They learn which emotions are safe to express and which ones will cause a reaction that they will then have to manage. And they carry those lessons into every relationship that follows. A person who learned to manage a parent's emotions as a child will almost certainly manage a partner's emotions as an adult. Not because they want to, because it is the only model they have. It is how relationships feel normal to them. They will be drawn to people who need managing, not because they enjoy it, because the feeling is familiar. A relationship where no one's emotions need to be carefully handled will feel strange to them, unsettling, maybe even boring. They will not know what to do with a partner who says, "Just tell me what you think," because no one in their history ever meant that. And they will be good at it. They will be excellent readers of tone and mood. They will be the person who can sense tension in a room before anyone else. They will know when someone is upset before that person says a word. These are survival skills learned young, disguised as sensitivity. People will admire them for it. "You're so perceptive. You always know what to say. You're so good with people." What those compliments really describe is someone who has spent their whole life scanning for danger in other people's faces. That is not a gift. That is training. And that is the deepest layer of emotional leverage. It does not just shape how people communicate. It shapes how people understand communication itself. It defines what feels possible in a conversation. And it sets the limits of what a person believes they are allowed to say. How emotional leverage breaks. Emotional leverage does not break easily, but it does break. And it usually breaks in one of three ways. The person stops absorbing the cost. At some point, the person on the lower end of the dynamic runs out of room. The pile of unsaid things gets too heavy. The distance between what they think and what they say becomes too wide. And they stop managing the other person's feelings. Not because they made a conscious decision, because they are too full to hold anything else. This is when relationships seem to suddenly fall apart. One day, the person who is always agreeable says something sharp, or they stop responding, or they leave, and the other person is stunned. Where did this come from? Everything was fine. It was not fine. It was managed. And the managing finally broke. Someone from the outside names it. Sometimes a friend, a therapist, or even a stranger says something that clicks. They describe the dynamic plainly. They say, "You know, you're allowed to say what you think, right?" And the person hears it and something shifts. This does not fix the dynamic overnight, but it gives the person language for what is happening. And language is the first step toward change, because once you can name it, you can stop blaming yourself for it. The person with leverage faces consequences. Sometimes the person with leverage loses the relationship, and in the aftermath, they start to see what they could not see before. They realize that the calm they enjoyed was not real. They realize that the compliance they received was not agreement. They realize that the person who left had been leaving for years in small ways, one withheld sentence at a time. This is often where the learning happens, not in the relationship, after it. And that is a painful truth about emotional leverage. The person who held it often does not understand it until it is too late. And the person who carried it often does not name it until they are gone. The person with less leverage finds a relationship where they are free. Sometimes the break does not come from confrontation or collapse. Sometimes it comes from contrast. The person on the lower end of the dynamic meets someone, a friend, a colleague, a new partner, who responds to honesty with openness instead of reaction. Someone who says, "Tell me more about that," instead of going quiet. Someone who hears a concern and says, "I'm glad you told me." And the person feels something they have not felt in a long time. Relief. The relief of not having to calculate, not having to scan the room, not having to choose between truth and safety. That contrast is often what makes the old dynamic unbearable. Not because the old relationship got worse, but because the person finally felt what ease was supposed to feel like, and they could not go back. What changes when you see it? Emotional leverage is not something you can unsee once you understand it. It shows up everywhere, in how people soften their emails at work, in how someone pauses before answering a question from their partner, in how a grown adult changes their tone when they call their parent. It shows up in the 3-second delay before someone speaks, in the apology that comes before a request, in the phrase, "I don't want to make this a big deal, but," which always means it is a big deal, and the person has already calculated the emotional cost of saying so. It shows up in the things people do not say, the feedback that never gets given, the boundary that never gets set, the truth that stays locked behind someone's teeth because they know what will happen if they let it out. You might start noticing it in text messages. When someone sends a long, carefully worded text that begins with, "I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way," they are not being cautious by nature. They are paying the fee. They are trying to say something true while managing the reaction they expect to receive. The length of the message is proportional to the amount of leverage the other person holds. Short, direct texts mean safety. Long, padded texts mean cost. You might notice it in meetings. The person who says, "This might be a dumb question," but is not lacking confidence. They are reading the room. They know that asking the question directly without the apology might land differently depending on who is listening. The disclaimer is not about them. It is about who else is in the room. And once you see it, you start to notice something else. You start to notice who in your life you speak freely around, and who in your life you edit yourself around. You notice where you feel relaxed, and where you feel careful, where your words come out straight, and where they come out bent. That difference, the gap between how you talk when you feel safe and how you talk when you do not, that is the footprint of emotional leverage. It is not always bad. It is not always intentional, but it is always there. And it always costs something. You might also notice it in yourself. You might realize that there are people whose moods you track before you speak, people whose faces you read before you decide what to say, people whose comfort you prioritize over your own honesty. And you might realize that you have been doing it for so long that you forgot it was a choice, or that it ever could have been different. That realization is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of something. Because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. And emotional leverage thrives on not being seen. The question is not whether it exists. The question is whether you are willing to see where it lives in your own conversations, and whether the people around you would say the same thing about how free they feel to speak. Because emotional leverage is never about the words that get said. It is always about the words that do not. And the space between what someone thinks and what someone says, that space is where relationships are actually built. Not in the conversations that happen. In the ones that never do.